All right, everybody, welcome to the webinar on multiband compression. Really glad you're here, and big thanks to Ian for agreeing to do this. This is going to be really exciting. I've been looking forward to this for a while. So we are at max capacity, so if you are in on the webinar, then you're one of the lucky ones. So we've got a lot of people trying to get in. There's just a certain number of people that can join, and we are full. So if you're here, thanks for being here, and I hope you get a lot out of it. Make sure to pay attention. Ian's got a lot of cool things to share with us today and a cool little announcement deal at the end. So this should be fun. If you could, just so make sure everything is working well, in the question box, go over to the question box and type in, "I can hear you," or something equally as, or maybe go for something a little funnier than "I can hear you." Okay. All right, everybody can hear us. Very cool. I see a lot of familiar faces here on the attendee list. John Tidy's here. Gabe Gibbett, Scott Colesby, lots of cool folks. So thank you all for showing up. Well, I'm just, if you're not familiar with me, my name is Joe Gilder. I run homestudiocorner.com, and I imagine some of you guys know me. If you guys come over from Ian's website, he's linked to my site in the past too. So this is my little website, and we're going to be talking to Ian of productionadvice.co.uk about multiband compression, which is a really cool topic, a really fun topic. It's a really cool thing to play with if you've never done it before. It's a really cool process, but it can be really hard to figure out. And Ian has been a big help to me personally figuring this stuff out, and he's put together some really good information to help us get things rolling. So everybody can hear me. We're in good shape. I'm going to turn it over to Ian. Ian, are you still there?
I'm here. Thanks, Joe.
There you are. Perfect. We're going to switch over to your screen and get things rolling.
Okay. I'm just looking at my screen, so tell me when I'm ready to go.
Will do. It keeps popping up telling me that people are trying to join, but they cannot. Okay, should be over to your screen here in a second.
Okay, well, I mean, when my screen appears, it'll be grey, and it'll have mastering with multiband compression at the top.
Okay.
That's because my focus is on using multiband compression in mastering. You can use it in anything. You can use it in mixing, and lots of people do. I prefer not to. I usually prefer to use normal compression and EQ, but you know, there are no rules. Whatever sounds good.
Right.
I thought I would start by just trying to explain in some fairly simple terms what multiband compression is. I mean, it's just compression. You can have other multiband processes. You could have multiband stereo enhancement or multiband gating or whatever. All the multiband means is that you're splitting the musical signal into different frequency ranges. So I've got just a few kind of images here to try and illustrate what I'm talking about. I hope you can all see the mouse. This coloured square down here is what's known as a spectrogram. It's just a way of representing a musical signal. You've got the high frequencies up at the top here, low frequencies down at the bottom, and then it's time going across. So where you can kind of see these vertical lines, that's probably, well, I'm guessing those are beats of the bar. Probably, I don't actually know which bit of music this picture is taken from, but that's probably beat 1, 2, 3, 4 of the bar. It's just a way of representing the music picture. If you just think high frequencies at the top, low frequencies at the bottom, you'll be fine. What a multiband processor, whether it's a compressor or anything else, does is split that into 3 bands. So I've illustrated that here by just chopping the image up, and the way I've done it to match the kind of settings that I tend to use. So we have the bass band down the bottom here, which is up to about 160 hertz thereabouts. It could be lower, it could be higher than that, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But so that's the bass band. Then the mid band runs from somewhere around 150-60 hertz up to maybe 3.5 kilohertz. And the high frequency band runs from 3.5 right up to 20 kilohertz. And if you the way these things work is that the bright colors mean where there's more signal happening. So you can see in the higher frequencies, the colors are fading down into purples and blues. because there's less signal energy right up there in the high frequencies, which is what we tend to hear with acoustic music signals. So what you do with a multiband compressor, I'm just going to turn my title off here, and just to make this a bit easier to think about, I'm going to just rotate that picture through 90 degrees. It's basically like splitting that frequency signal into 3 channels on a mixer. So you have the low frequency band, the mid band, and the high band as channels in a mixer. And the point of it is that you can process them separately. And in this case, we're talking about compression, but you could be talking about, like I say, in stereo enhancement, anything else. So I can get really stuck into the audio signal. I can heavily compress, say, the low frequency band, and the other 2 higher bands will be unaffected by that. Or you could squash the high frequency band down, perhaps, to reduce the high frequency content without affecting these other 2 bands. And that's the basic idea. And you could literally build this in a mixer. If you imagine you had your input signal and you used high and low pass filters to split that signal into 3 different sections and just routed from an auxiliary or a bus into separate channels in the desk, you could literally have 3 channels in your desk with the low frequencies, the mid and the high, and then you could put compressors on them. You need to be careful if you're doing that. You'd need linear phase EQ to avoid messing anything up too badly, but it would work. It would be a pretty clumsy way of doing it, and the nice thing about a multiband compressor is that you get all of that functionality in one process. So I'm just going to flick across to Logic here and show you the multiband compressor that I use in my home studio. This is the Melder Production multiband compressor, which some of you will have heard me talk about before. And if we just look at what's in the window here, you've got the low frequency band, you've got the mid and the high frequency band. You can choose where the crossovers of those bands are placed as to how you split your signal up. And then each band you see here, it changes from band 1, band 2, band 3. I only usually use 3 bands. I think using more than 3 bands is not helpful, and probably maybe if you feel that that's necessary, could be a signal. Actually, it'd be better to go back and make some adjustments to the mix to try and fix it there rather than at the mastering stage. But for each band, you've got separate attack, release, threshold, ratio settings, and each of those will work without being affected by the others. That's multiband compression in a nutshell. So the question is, what can you do with it, and why would you want to? So one of the things that I would commonly use it for is just to pull the mix together. The fact that you're compressing those frequency ranges separately means that, unlike, let's imagine just a single band compressor going over a whole mix. If you've got a kick drum in there that's standing out in the mix a bit too much, and you compress the whole mix to try and lift up the level and pull it all together a bit, you could end up with some pumping in there. And that might be something that you want, but it might not. Probably, if you're using a compressor over the whole mix, it's mix bus compression, you're probably doing that. You've had it in there since the beginning of the mix. You're unlikely to want to put another one in there. And if you start changing the parameters of that compressor too much, you're going to change all of your mix decisions. And one of my goals when I'm using multiband compression in mastering is to try and be as transparent as possible. I prefer that nobody would be able to tell that I'm using multiband compression most of the time. Sometimes I want to, do something that people can definitely hear. But when transparency is your goal, being able to say heavily compress the kick drum without causing pumping in the higher bands. Let's say you've got a sustained string pad, or somebody singing a long high note, or you've got a guitar solo. You don't necessarily want those pulsing away as the compressor reacts to the big kick drum sound in the mix. And that's what the multiband allows you to do.
And you've probably all heard that. I know if you take a mix and just put a regular compressor across that to the point where it's hitting pretty hard every time the kick drum hits, you can hear that the high frequencies get squashed down along with the kick drum. And that's the whole point. That pumping is, sometimes it's a cool effect, but a lot of times it's a telltale sign that you've compressed too much or that you need to be using that multiband compressor.
Yeah, it's a bit of a signature sound in a lot of rock and metal genres, but I think then I come back to the whole distinction between mastering and mixing. That's a creative decision that a mix engineer might choose to take. A mastering engineer wouldn't normally want to do that, and if you're mastering your own music, I feel like it should be the same way. You should make mix decisions in the mix, you should make mastering decisions in the mastering. So yeah, I wouldn't, I mean, there are some people who slap bus compression onto a mix right at the final stages, but I think the most successful way of using it is to have it there from the beginning, work with it so you're hearing the effect of everything you do. So putting that kind of compression on the final stage at the mastering stage would be kind of strange. So I want to avoid that when I'm using multiband compression. That's one of my goals. It's important to choose the frequency ranges to make that work. You need the low frequency band to be high enough that it's actually got some stuff going on. You know, there's not much going on in most mixes below 50 hertz, for example. So that's probably too low. If you take it up to more like 200, 250 hertz, then you're going to probably cause some pumping in the lower end of the other instruments in the mix that get there. So if it's up at say 200, 250 hertz, there's plenty of the low end of guitars, certainly the low end of the bass, maybe the low end of the vocals, keyboards, all that kind of stuff there. So if that low band is compressing heavily, then you're going to cause pumping in those things. Now that can sometimes be a good thing. If you have a bit of pumping, what happens if you think about the pumping, the kick drum comes in, the compressor pulls back, everything pulls back a bit. If you set a fairly long attack time, then you will hear the thump of the kick, everything else will pull back slightly away from it, and you'll actually feel like there's a little bit more space around that kick drum. So you can actually get some extra definition and some extra thump into the kick drum if that's the way that you go, especially if you put in a little EQ boost going into that to try and emphasize it. Coming around the other way, if you bring that frequency range down, then you've got less of the low frequencies of those other instruments in that low band. It's going to deal more just with the really low end stuff in the bass and the kick drum. And then you get the kind of opposite effect, this kind of gluing effect, where you can compress those without causing that pumping. Everything else stays up in the mix. And the whole mix just kind of seems to pull together quite nicely. And that's probably the main reason that I use multiband compression, is just to bring things into line. If there's something that's sticking out a little bit in the mix, it can be just controlled enough to make things work without kind of it feeling like blatant compression. So, you know, if there's a guitar solo that really comes out, or actually a classic example would be loud vocals. If you mix the vocals right up front in the mix and then get the right multiband compression working on it, the multiband will hold those vocals in check. It'll make a little space around them, because just in the same way that I talked about the kick drum. And the whole track you'll have these nice upfront vocals, but as soon as the vocals stop, everything else will lift back in to fill the gaps. And you can get a really nice effect that way.
So Ian, one of the questions from Charles is, would you use multiband compression when you're mixing on the stereo bus, or would you strictly save that for mastering? I think you covered that a little bit, but just to clarify.
I would definitely save that for mastering.
Okay.
I actually, I try and avoid being too kind of dictatorial in the things that I say,
right?
Because people get a hard time about it. But actually, don't use multiband compression when you're mixing, and the reason is, in some ways, it makes it easier. I mean, actually, just to go off a slight tangent, one reason maybe that the loudness wars are happening, and that generally the quality of mixing nowadays is not what it was, in my opinion, could be that these tools are now available and people are doing that. If you whack a multiband compressor over an entire mix and then just push all the faders up and start, you can get something that kind of sounds okay much quicker.
Mm-hmm.
But that's because the multiband compressor is doing a lot of the hard work for you. If you disable the multiband compressor, suddenly the whole thing falls to pieces. And that's one of my rules of thumb. If your mix relies on multiband compression, then the mix is not good enough. I guarantee if you do a mix where you get the sound as good as it can possibly be without multiband compression, then let a mastering engineer do his work and maybe use some if that's what he feels is necessary, and then compare it to that same mix where the multiband compression was in from the beginning. The one where you didn't have the multiband compression in the mixing will sound better because you're making better decisions, you're making better balanced decisions, you're choosing individual compression on the tracks relative to what they need, not relative to how they're reacting with the multiband. I can see sometimes when you might want to use it. If you need to get a reasonable result really quickly,
Mm-hmm.
it might make some sense. But as a rule of thumb, mixing through a multiband, it'll make you a lazy mixer. The one time you go to somebody and they don't have the right multiband plugin, or the hardware compressor you're using dies, you're suddenly going to find your mixing skills are not what you thought they were. So that probably covers that one.
And would you say the same
any other
applies
questions?
to specific tracks as well? If you have a troublesome bass track or vocal track, somebody was asking about using it on a vocal. I would imagine the same idea should probably be able to treat that with EQ and regular compression. It seems like multiband would just confuse things quite a bit.
I prefer to do it with regular compression than multiband. I wouldn't say I'd never say you can't.
Right.
I've read that some people who like to put the bass and drums as a stereo submix through a multiband as part of a mix,
Mm-hmm.
just to kind of pull them together nicely within the mix. If that works for you, then go for it. I would still get the bass and drums sounding as good as they possibly can before putting that compressor in. As an interesting example, I had to master an album 5 or 6 years ago now for Christine Tobin, who's a jazz singer, fantastic jazz singer, and she had a temporary master done by the studio that she was at, and they had basically just pushed this string through a Waves L1,
Mm-hmm.
and they'd used it hard. I mean, I never use that thing for more than a dB or two of. I don't use it at all anymore, but when I did use it, I would only maybe a dB or two. They were getting like 6 to 8 dBs of gain reduction with this thing, and it didn't sound nearly as bad as you might think.
Mm-hmm.
But when I went in with the multiband compression, she really didn't like the effect it had because it treated her vocal differently. If you think about a single band compressor, you have she had a very warm sounding voice, not a great deal of high frequency content in her voice. When you put that through a single band compressor, it controls it. That frequency balance stays the same. If you put that kind of voice into a multiband compressor, when she sings out loud, the mid-range, where all that warmth is going to be held back. And the high frequencies and the low frequencies are going to come through without very much happening to them. So the tone of her voice changed depending on how loud she sang, and she hated it because she felt it took away all the warmth. I actually thought when the compressor was working, she probably had a more balanced sound in her voice. But because it wasn't what she was used to hearing, and because she knew what her own voice sounded like, and she wasn't used to hearing that effect, it wasn't right for her. And I think I would be cautious about that same kind of effect, whatever you used it on. If you've got some kind of instrument that's, I'm trying to think of where I might. I heard somebody saying they used multiband on a kick drum in a mix, and I can't honestly imagine why you would want or need to do that.
Right.
I mean, can you? I don't, because the kick drum, it's thumped down at 50-60 and maybe some click up at 4 kilohertz and maybe some mid-range in, but I can't imagine why you would need to do that. Multiband makes sense to me working on a broad frequency source. So I mean, if you had a really dynamic, maybe an acoustic guitar part or a piano, okay, maybe if you had a piano part within a mix, having a multiband on a piano might work, because you could probably have some more aggressive compression in there without hearing any pumping artifacts. That could work maybe, but I pretty much 100% believe it's a mastering tool.
Cool.
And I should say, not always a mastering tool. Joe, I noticed you one of your tweets. You billed this as the secret to mastering. I would say it's a secret. It's not even really a secret these days, but it's one thing that mastering engineers have had for a long time. I was using multiband compression 15 years ago. I had a thing called the Aphex Dominator, which was a fantastic box. It was really simple. It basically just had an input drive. You could sweep the bands up and down a little bit, and that was pretty much it. It was great. I mean, you couldn't push it too hard, but it did the job. And it was a compressor limiter, so it was an interesting beast. But it's in the last kind of 5-10 years, these things have become mainstream, and everybody's had access to them. It's one tool in mastering. I wouldn't always use it at all. I do use it quite a lot. There are some mastering engineers who absolutely swear against it, won't have anything to do with it. But then I start to hear comments that I don't understand, like they say that it introduces phasiness into the mixes or phasing artifacts, and they say they don't like the fact that it changes the mix. And then I wonder how they're using it, because it can change the mix, but you can set it up so that it doesn't change the mix. It shouldn't cause phasing artifacts if it's a well-designed piece of kit, because the crossovers in the bands should be nice and gentle, and they should be linear phase filters so that there's no phase changes involved with the filters, so it doesn't matter what they're doing. So yeah, I think it's a valuable tool, and I use it quite regularly, but quite gently. If a few dBs gain reduction in each band can make a huge difference to a mix, even though it's quite kind of benign as far as compression goes. Where you might get a weird effect with multiband is if you put the crossover in the wrong place. If the crossover cuts an instrument in half, let's think of that high band. Let's just flick back to Logic. This one here. If it's up at 3.5, 5K, basically you've got fizzy toppy stuff in this top band, and this is all the mid. If you bring that down too low, you're going to start putting the crossover right in the middle, probably, of where the vocals and the guitars are. So you're going to have the low end of the guitars affected by one band and the high end of the guitars affected by the other band. And that could be the kind of area where you might get a problem. Because again, you're going to have an instrument. It's like on Christine's voice. You're going to have an instrument that's being compressed differently in different frequency ranges, and that could have a weird effect. So maybe those engineers are using multiband in a different way than I do, and that's why they're having problems. Another point I want to make is that using multiband compression should be, for me, should be a very interactive part of the process. I don't just have a mix, put on a multiband compressor, and listen to it and think, okay, that works or that doesn't work. When I'm mastering with multiband compression, it's okay. Let's bring the mix up to the right level. I'll tell you what, I could pause and just tell you about signal chain briefly. The way that I set things up is to have an equalizer first in the chain, just to add some EQ, then running into the multiband compressor, and then I always have a limiter right at the end of the chain, just to control any peaks. Because I tend to prefer longer attack times in the multiband. I think that sounds more transparent.
Sure.
And the limiter will control anything that gets through those, any little peaks. It's not working hard. 3-4 dBs at the most, I would usually say, and only on very short. It's not cutting into because the compressors are dealing with the body of the sound, the weight of the sound. It's just drum transients and the attacks on guitar notes and all that really fast stuff. So you get a really clean effect that way. That's a good mastering tip in general, actually, is to use little things in many stages rather than trying to use one thing to do huge changes at a time.
Sure. Well, let me jump into one of these questions here. This is from Hernan. He says, I'm an electronic musician and I use 4-band multiband compression on my masters to give special attention to the low end, 90 to 100 hertz, or up to 100 hertz. and also to divide the low mids and the high mids. He wants to know if that's okay, or should he only use a band for all the lows versus splitting the lows and the low mids up.
It's okay if it works for you. And there are less rules with electronic music because the sounds generally are not, in inverted commas, natural. They're not, they're not acoustic sounds. So I wouldn't say never do that. Personally, I tend to only use more than 3 bands for problem solving. I feel like 3 bands is enough. I guess that comes back to this whole transparency thing. If I want to hear any compression at all from a multiband compressor, I would like it to sound as similar to well done bus compression as possible. So I guess that those frequency bands that I've that I've suggested there, up to kind of 150 hertz and then 3.5 kilohertz. You've got a huge chunk of signal there, 150 hertz right up to 3.5 kilohertz. That's a lot of the musical signal. I mean, if you muted the high and low bands, it would still be recognizably music.
Right.
And that I think that sounds natural. I mean, examples of where you might want to use more than 4 bands would be if you wanted to try and de-ess something. That's another thing that I think is probably better done in the mix. But if you have to do it in the mastering, then maybe finding a narrow band where the S's were sticking out, compressing that heavily and pulling it back could work.
Right.
Or if you had some kind of problem instrument, I tend to use it more for when there are mixes that have problems. If you're mastering your own material, you've always got the option to go back to the mix. And if you're really struggling with the mastering, I would always suggest you do that. As a professional mastering engineer, you don't always have that luxury. People come in and you say, "Oh, it'd be really nice if you could do this, this, and this," and they say, "Well, it has to go to the plant tomorrow, so let's just work with what we have." And in that case, then you can get more creative in terms of trying to deal with problem areas. Using a specific band, but so no, I wouldn't say 4 bands is wrong, but I don't often feel the need to have 4 bands dealt with differently. In
general, how can multiband compression for dance music give the kick more thump? What are you thinking? I guess in general, if you're wanting to give more, obviously, say the mix has a decent amount, but you want to enhance that when you're mastering. Versus, I'm guessing the question is versus just boosting the low end with an EQ. How is multiband going to make that? How is it a better option than just doing a big boost down at 60 hertz?
That's a good question, because it reminds me what I was going to say, which is that for me, the EQ, the compression, and the limiting all play against each other, so you adjust all of them. It's not just a question of putting a compressor on and seeing how it sounds. I actually choose my EQ going into the compression to get the result that I want. So to take that example in particular, if you want to get more thump in a kick drum, then yes, I would probably boost it at 50, 60 hertz or 100 hertz if you want that kind of higher up heartbeat kind of sound. Wherever it needs that boost. The nice thing about doing it into a multiband compressor is it won't slam it straight up into a limiter, and heavy bass thumping into a limiter is going to cause pumping, is going to cause distortion, and is going to make the mix feel unstable. And also, it has this real blunt sound that I don't like. I'll put that to one side and come back to that point in a minute. Whereas if you go into a multiband compressor, it's hard to, it's kind of like you can get more feel to it, you can get a bounce, you can tune the attack and the release times to suit the material, so that instead of just going thump into a brick wall, it's going into a 2-to-1 ratio, so it's a much gentler form of compression. You can have it cut in and release at the right times to get the feel that you want, and it doesn't affect anything else in the mix. So for thump, I would have a relatively long attack time so that the weight of that sound comes through well. And then it depends how aggressive you want to get. If lower ratios will sound a little bit softer than higher ratios, but will keep more dynamics. So if I have a mix where I really think it needs a pounding kick drum and it's not working for me, I would probably go for something like a 4:1 ratio in the low band, quite a long attack time and a higher threshold, so that, and then an EQ boost going into that, so that you have that, all of that initial dynamic of the sound, and then suddenly very hard control. Because the problem is, if you do that without any compression, you will end up with pumping higher up. So I think, to sum that up, you can, in general, multiband compression lets you use much more aggressive EQ boosts and cuts without completely unbalancing the mix. Same thing's true in a high frequency band. If you want to bring out a guitar solo or a guitar sound in general without making the vocals sound horribly harsh, multiband can be a good way of doing that, because you can have that big EQ boost and the compression controls it to some extent, tempers it, and you can trade the two off against each other. The mastering process for me is set the level, choose an EQ, adjust the compression, listen to it again, and then just go back to the beginning, tweak the level, tweak the EQ, tweak the compression, listen, tweak, and you go round and round in circles until you're happy. So yeah, if I start off mastering a track and it needs that thump, so I put in a huge EQ boost, I'm thinking, well, now that just the bottom end is kind of sounding, the weight of the bass is there, but it's not punchy enough, then I might try a higher ratio to try and get that back, for example.
Very cool.
Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the questions that are kind of coming in, I think probably one thing that would answer a lot of those is there any way you can show us a typical, what a mastering session looks like for you as far as plugins? I think for me, when I first started doing some mastering, and obviously I'm not anywhere near your experience, but I just kind of figuring out what the order should be, which plugin should be where, turned out to be a little more of a head scratcher than I had originally had thought.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I actually did a blog post on this. Can I remember what it was called so I can find it for you guys?
I'll see if I can find it over here on my end.
Okay. But I can show you again quickly. I kind of quickly went through it earlier on. So in this case, I have the EQ and the compressor on different channels, but that's not necessary. What I tend to do is I tend to have a track for each song. So let's imagine that was the first song on the album, and I could put the second song on the album there. When I was first trained as a mastering engineer, I was only using a limiter for doing my mastering, and I think there were a few reasons for that. One is the average level of masters was at least 4, 5, 6 dBs lower than it is today.
Right.
So it was easier to get mixes up to the required level without using excessive limiting, because it's excessive limiting that sounds bad. Another one I think is that maybe the mixes in those days were generally of a higher standard. The Project Studio thing was only just getting going, so there was still a lot of professionally recorded stuff coming through, so the dynamic control in the mixes was better in the first place. And I think a combination of those two things meant that at that point it was perfectly reasonable to use just a limiter on a master. And again, that fits in perfectly. The limiter is probably the most transparent way of compressing and controlling a source, providing it's not really heavily used. And that fits in exactly with the ethos of a professional mastering engineer, which is to do as little as possible to make the sound as good as possible. And I remember maybe around 2000 when I first got the TC Electronics M5000, which was the kind of the big brother that the Finalizer followed on from, and that was the beginning of the whole trend. Maybe it was, no, it must have been earlier than that, because I guess it was mid-90s. Yeah, so that's, I think that's where there's a slight disconnect between the people know the theory of mastering, which is you just need EQ and a limiter, which comes kind of back from that happier time, but they're trying to achieve the modern sounds that people are going for, the level and all of the rest of it, using a limited tool set. I don't think you can get the levels as high as you need them these days without multiband compression, probably, without causing damage. I've heard plenty of masters that are right up there in level by modern standards, but you can hear them pumping away. And I mean, a classic example is the Atomic Bomb U2 album. I can't remember How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb. There is some incredible compression pumping and ducking going on that album. I had no idea whether it was done in the mastering or the mixing, but I would have sent it back. Anyway, so to come back to the signal structure, yeah, if you've got, I can't remember how far you guys got. I have each song on a separate track. That means I can have separate settings so that there's no EQ there, but there is EQ here. In this particular project, I've got the multiband on the output, but I could just as well, in fact, I would normally, oh, so many options, multiband dynamics, there. So you have separate EQ and multiband compression settings on each channel and therefore on each song. And then, so you can balance, I'm always flicking between songs when I'm mastering, and I can tweak the parameters here and I can tweak the parameters here. That's different to how I used to work a couple of years ago, when I was doing everything in hardware, because we're talking here specifically about a kind of a home mastering setup that you can use in your own workstation. But in the studio, I would actually just loop all of this stuff out through some hardware externally and record it back in and do it song by song. And the nice thing about doing it this way is, obviously, if I change my mind having mastered this song about the way that this one should sound, I can just go back and tweak the settings and they all get saved in the session. And so, you know, it's a nice flexible way of working. But for me, it's always EQ first, maybe some stereo processing. I have a stereo processor in there, but it's switched off. Then some compression, maybe some more EQ after the compression. EQ after compression sounds very different to EQ before compression. I tend to almost always use it before and then just do some kind of maybe some little surgical tweaks afterwards. But it's nice to have that flexibility. And then a limiter here, that can just go on the output bus because I never really changed the parameters of that because it's just catching peaks. And then the final thing I have is the TT dynamic range meter for my metering. Are there any specific, does that cover what people are asking about the routing of the plugins?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's just one of those little mysteries that doesn't seem to get talked about too much. And yeah, I think that, especially for me, just simple things like the gain plugin. I think it's so simple, but I hadn't thought putting it.
I haven't mentioned that. So it's,
yeah,
so let's just kind of cover that specifically. Again, if I'm, so I have a limiter there, and the dynamic range meter on the output. On each channel, for each song, you've got the EQ, but I have gain first. So the reason I do that is so that when I bypass the multiband, the level of the song is not going to change dramatically. In the multiband, we've got an input gain here, which we can change, and then there's an individual input gain for each band. Although you can see this fault of that has 4 bands. Look, so I would kill one of those.
Shame.
But if we tweak these input gains, or this input gain, when we hit bypass, not only is all the compression bypassed, but so is that gain. So the signal will drop by, you know, if we're boosting it by 3 dBs, the signal you're hearing will drop by 3 dBs. And okay, that's another good point to make. If you're comparing two things that are not level matched, you can't make a fair comparison between them. Anything that's slightly louder usually sounds slightly better. It's another one of the root causes of the loudness wars. But so you will fool yourself if you are listening to something and you bypass it and it gets slightly quieter. That's the reason that people advise you to cut EQ rather than boosting. Boosting EQ changes the signal level more than cutting EQ. Mm-hmm. So when you bypass the EQ, it could automatically sound better to you just because it's louder. So whenever you're doing comparisons, especially in mastering where it's so critical, I would always get those levels matched. And a quick way to do that is to apply the gain here before it goes into the multiband compressor rather than in the multiband compressor. Then when you bypass the compressor, you don't hear a dramatic gain change. You'll hear some kind of change because the compressor is changing the dynamics of the song.
Right.
But it's a fairer comparison. And I'm using it as a plugin because I have these processes here set up as inserts on this channel, and the fader down here is usually post the insert. You know, the insert happens, it's the input to the channel goes through the insert, back in, and then out to the fader. I know that some, I mean, I'm not a Logic Ninja, maybe I can configure that, maybe somebody can send me an email, tell me how to fix that, but the it's safer. I also think it's conceptually good to have a separate plugin here. It just reminds you that that's what you're doing. It also makes it easy to automate.
Yeah.
So one thing that's nice to do sometimes is to automate the gain going into the compressor, and that's really easy if you've just got a single parameter there to tweak, and you get it up as a graph in the DAW. If you're trying to do that as the input to the multiband, it can get pretty horribly confusing.
Right.
Level matching, you use the TT dynamic range meter to figure out how loud the music is and then adjust the levels, but use your ears.
Right.
You know, the measurements can only get you so far. And a good hint there is to listen out for the vocal levels. Quite often, regardless of what else is happening in the track, if you get the vocal levels so that they seem to sit right next to each other, then that's the right balance between the levels of the tracks.
Cool. Well, cool. Well, I mean, the rest of the questions that are coming in are very specific, kind of jumping into very specific examples of the how-to. And the main point of this webinar was to cover what multiband compression does, why it's useful, some uses for it, and then Ian, you've actually prepared something for those who want to go in depth, a way they can get in there and really get their feet wet, so to speak, with multiband compression.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if people want more information on all of this kind of stuff, and I think I've covered a lot of points, but it's been a bit rambling and confused. If you want a really kind of step-by-step, well laid out explanation of all of that, I've just put together an ebook, which is on sale to my list today, and Joe will have a link that he can put in the chat or on the webinar page for any of his guys who want to check it out. And there's it's at a discount for the next week. It's for anybody who wants to kind of get in there early on that. But yeah, so it's an ebook, and there's also a video if you would like, where I go through all of this stuff from the beginning. There's an introduction where you talk about just what is mastering and some of the basic concepts that we've been talking about, and then it gets into it tells you what my default settings for multiband compression are. I quite often start with very similar settings to begin with and then tweak them. So what those are and why they are, why I've chosen them. Then it has kind of some rules of thumb for you about how to set up a multiband compressor, what to listen for, how to listen for problems. It goes through all of those parameters in lots of detail, how to choose crossover bands, how to choose ratios, attack and release times, where to put the crossovers, and again, why all of those things matter. There's some stuff on more advanced techniques in there, like this whole business about EQing, going in to try and sculpt the mix to get some control over it. There's some troubleshooting stuff, you know, what to do if you hear problems when you're using multiband compression, the kind of things you can do to solve those problems. And I've really, you know, my goal was to, if I've been successful, if you get this ebook and you read it and you can put what I'm saying in it to use, you will know everything about multiband compression that was taught when I first became a mastering engineer, and that I've figured out over the 15 years that I've been using it. And then the video is, when I was doing the ebook, lots of people got in touch with me and said that they would really like a video, so that they can actually see and hear what I'm doing. So the video kind of works alongside it, to literally that. I'm working in Logic with the plugins. I'm using a track called, you can see it here in this project, It's All Right. by Monsoon Drive, a really cool band from Iceland. It was recorded by, I think he's a guitarist, a guy called Thor from Sugar Cubes. I know, he really is called Thor. And it was mixed by Sigurdur Gudmundsson, who is our good friend from Twitter and the forums. And
he is here today, actually.
Hi, Sigurdur. I need to speak to you and figure out if I'm saying your name right, because it has all kinds of interesting
symbols,
swirly bits in the name. I don't know how they work.
I know.
I have some of my cousins are Icelandic, so I should know, but I don't.
I've got no connections to Iceland. But for those of you, I just sent the link out in the chat for the webinar, so you should see that there. Click on that and check it out. I've read the ebook, and it's fantastic. Especially coming from a perspective of I got into mastering some and was way over my head when I even tried to figure things out. Much less I'd pull up the multiband compressor and just a couple hours later I'd just be punching myself in the face because I was so frustrated, not sure where to start, because there's 3 different compressors there that all work together, but they don't work together, and you try to. The big thing I got into was setting up and tweaking the settings on each band specifically, and then thinking it sounded good, but then realizing it was just all certain bands were pumping and others weren't, and it's really frustrating. And so Ian, over the course of just reading the ebook, not even watching the videos yet, I haven't seen the videos yet, he gives you a step-by-step guide to what to do with multiband compression, how to set it up, and it essentially gives you a preset for how he sets it up when he begins each mastering session. And obviously you have to use your ears. There's no preset, there's no template that will give you a good sounding master every time, but he gives you some good rules to follow as you go through that process and good starting points to get you going. And it will literally save you hours and hours of trying to figure it out on your own. I'm not saying that you're unintelligent and couldn't figure it out, but it's just let his 15 years of experience, he already did the hard work of figuring it out, so let him just explain it to you in the ebook and the videos. It's a really, really good value. One of the best best audio related books I've read in a long, long time.
Why, thank you.
That's my 2
really
cents.
Kind of you.
Well, it's just I was so excited. I kept going to the next page like, oh, that makes sense. I can't wait to do that. It's just one of those really exciting, practical type of ebooks.
That's really cool, because that's exactly what I was going for. I wanted it to be. I didn't actually say this in the ebook. When I was writing it in my head, when I started thinking about it a couple of months ago, I was going to say, this is not going to be an in-depth guide. It's just going to tell you what you need to know to get working now. And it ended up being an in-depth guide because people wanted that. People kept wanting real detail. But I also tried to keep it really kind of practical and usable. And I'm getting great. You've given me great feedback, and Big Al came back and said he thought it was great, and I showed it to a mastering engineer friend of mine who said, "Are you sure you want to give all of this stuff away?" I think the key thing that I tried to bring out in the ebook, I hope it works, is that I think one of the problems that people have with multiband compression is that they let it get too complicated. The thing to do is to try and keep it simple. When you've got these multiple bands and all of these parameters and you're dealing with an entire mix, it's so easy for it just to slip away from you. You lose sight of what you're trying to achieve. So it's all about keeping it simple. Like I say, that whole mastering thing of do as little as you can for the best possible result. It's that whole less is more philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really excited to see what people make of it. It's if anybody decides to get it, then please do drop me an email and tell me what you think. Ask me some questions if you need anything followed up, so that I can make any future version of it even better. But it really was my goal to just try and give as much value as I possibly could on this topic, and it ended up being it's a very focused thing on this one topic, but it covers a lot of ground in terms of that mastering, and it links out to other stuff on my blog, so there's a lot of material there that people can pull in if that's what they want to do.
Absolutely.
So
if you guys know Ian, he's what he mentioned briefly was the mastering engineer that said, "Are you sure you want to share this information?" It's for whatever reason, audio engineers are really they play their hand close to the vest. They don't want to share a lot of their tips because, to be honest, a lot of us audio folk are really insecure, and if somebody knows your secret for one thing, then they might replace you. And I think it's silly, but it's out there. And Ian's one of the few people who He's been doing this for years, and if you go to his blog, he's got just hundreds of articles and really just practical, helpful information there. This is his first ebook, I believe, Ian, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
And first thing you've actually charged for, and I honestly think the stuff on your website you could charge for, and because it's so good. But if you guys enjoy Ian and then all the work he's put into it, definitely check out the ebook. It's worth looking into, and it's just really good information. And again, the link, I sent it out on the little chat. It should have shown up in your chat box, and we'll be emailing you guys after the webinar to make sure you got everything you need. But a lot of the questions you guys are having towards the end, those will be explained in the ebook. And just real quickly, Sigurdor says the video is brilliant. I haven't seen the video yet, but he says it's brilliant. So coming from him,
hey, thank you.
That sounds right. So, well, Ian, is there anything else you've got? I think we've covered it all.
No, I think we've covered most of the ground. I mean, if anybody, you can stick my email address up in the chat window there. If
Sure.
anybody wants to send me a message, ask me any other questions, or they can get me on Twitter as @IanShepherd, PHERD. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks for showing up. Over the course of the webinar, I had several people email me that they couldn't get in because it was full. So thank you guys for sticking around, and hope it was really helpful for you. So we'll end the webinar, and we'll see you guys another day. Thanks again, Ian, for agreeing to do this. This is really great.
No, thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure.
All right. Talk soon.